It begins with a silence where a bustling town should be, a silence that hangs heavy and thick under the humid sky of the New World. It's a silence that is stretched across more than 4 centuries, a question mark carved into the very heart of American history. Before the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, before the settlement of Jamestown, there was a dream, a fragile English dream planted on the shores of Roanoke Island. And then there was nothing. Nothing but a single cryptic word carved into a wooden post: CROATOAN. This is not a story of a battle lost or a plague that swept through a terrified populace. There were no bodies, no graves, no signs of a struggle. It is a quieter, more profound mystery, a story of 117 men, women, and children who walked into the vast, whispering wilderness of a new continent and vanished from the pages of history, leaving behind a ghost story that still haunts us today. Our story begins not in the untamed wilds of America, but in the crowded, ambitious heart of Elizabethan England. It was an age of daring exploration, of immense wealth and crippling poverty, of poetry and political intrigue. And at the center of it all was a man who embodied the spirit of his time, Sir Walter Raleigh. A courtier, a poet, a soldier, and a relentless visionary, Raleigh was captivated by the idea of an English empire in the New World. He saw a land of unimaginable resources, a place to challenge the dominance of Spain, and a chance to plant the English flag permanently in the rich soil of North America. He had received a charter from Queen Elizabeth I herself, a grant to establish a colony in the territory she named Virginia, in honor of her own carefully crafted image as the Virgin Queen. Raleigh's first attempt in 1585, a military outpost led by Ralph Lane, had been a failure. Plagued by a lack of supplies and deteriorating relations with the native Algonquian tribes, the all-male settlement was abandoned after just a year. But Raleigh was not a man easily deterred. For his next venture, he envisioned something different, something with deeper roots. He planned not just an outpost, but a true settlement, a home. He recruited families, farmers, and artisans. This time, there would be women and children, the very seeds of a new English nation. To lead this ambitious undertaking, he chose a man named John White. White was not a soldier or a hardened adventurer in the typical sense. He was an artist, a cartographer whose sensitive watercolor paintings from the first expedition provide us with the only surviving visual record of the Algonquian people and their way of life. He was a man of observation and detail, perhaps more suited to capturing the soul of the New World on paper than to governing it. Yet he was driven by a profound personal investment in the colony's success. Among the colonists sailing with him were his own daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, Ananias Dare, and Eleanor was pregnant. In the spring of 1587, 3 small ships, the Lion, a flyboat, and a pinnace, departed from Portsmouth, England, carrying the hopes of 117 colonists. The journey was arduous. From the start, there was tension between Governor White and Simon Fernandez, the pilot of the fleet, a man whose loyalty seemed more tied to his own interests than to the colony's success. The original plan, carefully laid out by Raleigh, was to settle in the Chesapeake Bay, a more sheltered and promising location than Roanoke. Roanoke Island was meant to be a brief stop, simply to check on a small garrison of 15 men left behind by the previous expedition. But when they arrived at Roanoke in late July 1587, they found the fort razed and no sign of the men, save for a single skeleton picked clean by the elements. It was a grim welcome. Then, in a fateful act of defiance, Simon Fernandez refused to sail the colonists any further. He insisted they disembark and establish their settlement right there, on the haunted grounds of the failed first colony. Governor White, whose authority on the land was absolute, but whose command at sea was challenged by the seasoned pilot, was forced to relent. And so, reluctantly, the City of Raleigh was born on Roanoke Island, a place it was never meant to be. Despite the ominous beginning, the colonists set to work with a determined spirit. They repaired the abandoned houses and began the painstaking process of carving a life out of the wilderness. For a time, there was hope. John White, using his past experience, worked to re-establish peaceful relations with the local tribes. A CROATOAN man named Manteo, who had traveled to England with a previous expedition and become a steadfast ally to the English, was baptized and named Lord of Roanoke, a symbolic gesture of unity. Then, on August 18, 1587, a moment of profound significance occurred. Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Virginia Dare. Virginia Dare was the first English child born in the New World, a symbol of a future that seemed, in that moment, full of promise. She was the living embodiment of the colonists' dream. But the dream was fragile. The colony had arrived too late in the season to plant crops for a full harvest. The supplies they had brought were dwindling rapidly. Tensions with some of the local tribes, inherited from the aggressive actions of the previous military colony, still simmered. It became terrifyingly clear that without a new shipment of provisions, the colony would not survive the coming winter. The colonists, desperate, placed their trust in the one man they believed could save them. They begged their governor, John White, to sail back to England and plead their case for immediate relief. White was torn. To leave meant abandoning his family, his daughter, his son-in-law, and his newborn granddaughter, Virginia, who was only days old. He was the governor, and his place was with his people. But he was also the man with the artistic skill and the courtly connections to make their plight understood in London. After much persuasion, he reluctantly agreed. Before he left, he and the colonists devised a simple code. If they had to move from Roanoke Island, they were to carve the name of their destination on a tree or post. If they were in distress or had been forced to leave, they were to carve a Maltese cross above the name. With this somber agreement in place, John White sailed from Roanoke on August 27, 1587, promising to return with all possible speed. It was the last time he would ever see any of them. White's journey back to England was the beginning of a nightmare of delays. When he arrived, he found his homeland in a state of high alert. King Philip II of Spain was amassing an enormous fleet, the Spanish Armada, with the goal of invading England and overthrowing Queen Elizabeth. All available ships were commandeered for the defense of the realm. No vessel capable of crossing the Atlantic was to be spared. White's pleas for the Roanoke colony were lost in the urgent preparations for war. For 3 agonizing years, John White was a man trapped. He petitioned the Queen. He pleaded with Sir Walter Raleigh. He tried to secure passage on any ship he could, but his efforts were constantly thwarted. The war with Spain took precedence over a tiny, fledgling settlement thousands of miles away. Finally, in 1590, after the threat of the Armada had passed, White managed to secure passage back to Roanoke, not on a dedicated supply mission, but aboard a privateering expedition heading to the West Indies. The voyage was long and fraught with its own dangers, but on August 18, 1590, his granddaughter Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday, John White finally saw the shores of Roanoke Island once more. As his ship approached, his heart leaped. In the distance, rising from the island, he saw a column of smoke. It was a sign, he believed, a signal from his long-suffering colonists that they had endured, that they were waiting. But as they drew closer, the smoke disappeared. An unsettling quiet seemed to settle over the island. White, the ship's captain, and a small party of sailors rowed ashore and made their way toward the settlement. The silence was the first thing that struck them. The familiar sounds of a living community, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children, the lowing of livestock were all gone. When they reached the site of the colony, they found it fortified with a palisade of tall wooden posts, suggesting the colonists had felt the need for defense after he left. But the settlement itself was empty. The houses had been carefully dismantled, not burned or destroyed, but taken down. There was no sign of a battle, no human remains, nothing to suggest a violent end.
It was as if the entire population had simply packed up their belongings and walked away. White's search grew more desperate. He scoured the area for any sign, any message. His own chests, which he had buried for safekeeping, had been dug up and ransacked, their contents, including his precious books and maps, ruined by the rain. This, he reasoned, was likely the work of local tribesmen after the colonists had already departed. But where had they gone? He remembered their agreement, the code they had established. He began to examine the trees and posts of the palisade. On one tree, he found 3 letters carved into the bark, C-R-O. And then he found it. Carved into a prominent post near the entrance to the abandoned settlement was a single, clear word: CROATOAN. White stared at the inscription, a wave of relief washing over his fear. CROATOAN was the name of a nearby island, the home of Manteo and his people, who had remained friendly to the English. And most importantly, there was no Maltese cross carved above the word. This was not a sign of distress. It was the message they had agreed upon. They had moved. They were safe. He now had a destination. He knew where he had to go. But the cruelties of fate were not yet finished with John White. As he and his men prepared to sail south for CROATOAN Island, the weather turned. A great hurricane, a common peril in those waters, descended upon them with terrifying force. The storm raged, damaging the ships and losing a critical anchor, making a search along the treacherous coastline impossible. His fellow sailors, weary from their long journey and unwilling to risk their lives and their vessel any further, refused to stay. They insisted on returning to England before the season grew too late. John White, heartbroken and powerless, was forced to sail away from the shores of America for the final time, leaving the mystery of his family and his colony unsolved, sealed behind a wall of wind and water. He would never raise the funds to return. He died years later, never knowing the true fate of the 117 souls he had led to the New World. And so, the silence resumed. What happened to the lost colonists of Roanoke? The word CROATOAN seemed to offer a clear answer, yet it became the opening chapter of an enduring American mystery. Did they, as the carving suggests, travel to CROATOAN Island, modern-day Hatteras Island, to live with Manteo's people? This remains the most popular and compelling theory. The colonists had a good relationship with the CROATOAN, and it would have been a logical place to seek shelter and sustenance. Archaeological work on Hatteras Island has uncovered English artifacts from that period, lending credence to the idea that at least some of the colonists integrated with the local population. But other theories abound, whispered through the corridors of history. One idea is that the colony, desperate for a more sustainable location, made their way to their original destination in the Chesapeake Bay. Years later, settlers at Jamestown heard tales from the Powhatan tribe of people who looked like them, who had been living among another tribe before being slaughtered. Could this have been the Roanoke colonists? Another possibility is that they moved inland, up the Albemarle Sound. An intriguing clue exists on a map drawn by John White himself. A patch on the map conceals a symbol that appears to be a fort located about 50 miles inland, the very distance White had instructed the colonists to travel if they moved. Recent archaeological digs in that area have also unearthed English artifacts from the late 16th century. Perhaps the colony split up, with one group going to CROATOAN and another heading inland. Less likely theories suggest a more violent end. Some have speculated that the Spanish, who were determined to drive the English from the New World, found and destroyed the colony. However, there was no evidence of a battle, and the Spanish were still searching for Roanoke years later. And what of the severe drought that afflicted the region at that time? Tree ring data shows that the colonists arrived during the most extreme drought in 800 years, lasting from 1587 to 1589. This would have led to a massive food shortage, not just for the English, but for the surrounding native tribes as well, potentially leading to conflict or starvation. The story of Roanoke is a haunting reminder of the fragility of beginnings, a tale of hope and ambition, swallowed by the immense, indifferent wilderness. It's a story that lives in the space between historical fact and folklore. The colonists were not soldiers or mythic heroes, they were families. They were people like Eleanor Dare, holding her newborn daughter and dreaming of a new life. They were farmers and artisans, hoping to build something that would last. They stepped off their ships into a world they did not understand and disappeared, leaving behind only a name whispered by the wind through the cypress trees. CROATOAN, a clue that was perhaps an answer that only deepened the mystery, a mystery that has become America's oldest unsolved story. What do you think is the most compelling theory? Did they assimilate with the CROATOAN, or did they meet a different fate? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you appreciate these deep dives into historical mysteries, a like would be greatly appreciated. And please subscribe to Historic Footnotes for more stories that time almost forgot.